Missouri. Thank you for being with us, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I want to first thank Matthew, Even, and all the team at the International Relations Council for the invitation to speak today about my country, Venezuela. I appreciate the invitation and the interest in Venezuela and what's happening there. As you mentioned, Matthew, I spent almost 6 years living in Missouri. So when I got this invitation, I was really happy to somehow go back to Missouri. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on, what's happening in Venezuela, and I want to provide a little bit of background about Venezuela and then talk about why exactly Venezuela is important for the United States, and also why Venezuela has been in many headlines recently. Venezuela is a Caribbean and South American country that is part of the entry to South America. Its location and resources make Venezuela a unique geostrategic country. Venezuela has approximately 29 million people, and its capital is Caracas. One important fact about Venezuela is that today, oil accounts for 98% of Venezuela export revenues. Venezuela pretty much exports oil and has to import everything that consumes. Three interesting facts about Venezuela are, first, that the Angels Falls in the south part of Venezuela is considered the highest waterfall in the world. If you have watched the film Up by Pixar, you know which waterfall I'm talking about. The second interesting fact is that Venezuela is a country that has the most oil reserve in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia, which comes second in the ranking. And third, for those that like baseball like me, after the Dominican Republic, Venezuelans are the most significant Latin American players in the Major Baseball League in the United States. At least more than 400 players have been sent to the Major League since the end of the 30s. Now, Venezuela was a strategic country for the United States during the 20th century. This was the case for at least three reasons. First, during the First World War, both countries worked together to prevent the European war from spreading to the Western Hemisphere. Second, the Venezuelan oil production. Venezuela was once a significant oil supplier for the United States and other Western European countries. In fact, many American companies operated in Venezuela between 1914, when oil was discovered in Venezuela, and 1954. Venezuela was quickly identified as a country that showed incalculable potential for petroleum extraction. And of course, this translated into significant amounts of capital investment by large oil companies and medium and small oil companies. During World War II, for example, Venezuela was the most secure provider of oil to the United States and countries in Western Europe, and had to increase its production at that time by 42% between 1943 and 1945 to satisfy the demand for wartime oil. And the third reason why Venezuela was so important for the United States in the 20th century is because specific leaders in the United States and Venezuela were eager to improve bilateral relationships. Venezuela attained democracy after 1958, and it was one of the few countries that was taking the democratic path in Latin America, while other countries were having dictatorial regimes, particularly military regimes like in Chile, like in Argentina, in Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. In the 60s, President Kennedy was determined to improve relations with Latin America through economic cooperation. And this cooperation also aimed to inhibit the presence of communism in Latin America. Let's just remember that the Cold War and the ideological division between communism and capitalism started at the end of the 40s. Venezuela was one of the countries that cooperated with the United States to promote democracy and social reforms, and also to exclude the widespread of communism ideas in Latin America. But in the late 80s, things changed. Much economic turmoil led to governments in Venezuela and political parties to lose base support. Many protests took place. There is one major protest called El Caracazo, which took place in 1989. This major wave of protests, riots, and looting spread mostly to Caracas, the capital, For many analysts, this was the start point that triggered the weakening of the two classical political parties in Venezuela and, quite honestly, democracy in Venezuela. In the late 90s, Hugo Chavez, the same officer that organized a coup early in the 90s and was acquitted from jail, rose to power on a populist platform that promised to redistribute Venezuela's oil wealth and political power from corrupt elites to the people of Venezuela. And under Chavez's presidency, which endured from 1999 until March 2013, Venezuela adopted a new constitution, a new name for the country, and multiple changes regarding its institutions and political branches. Chavez's charisma, use of oil revenues to fund social programs in Venezuela and abroad, as well as his opposition to the United States, captured global attention. Many remember Chavez's discourse in the United Nations accusing George Bush of being the devil, or many of the speeches he gave in Venezuela against the United States. Particularly after 2004, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela became problematic. And over time, both countries decided not only to reduce bilateral relationship until the point where both countries started to expel diplomats and envoys, but also it became problematic for trade between these two countries. After Chavez's death in March 2013, acting president Nicolas Maduro narrowly won a presidential election. Since April 2013, Nicolas Maduro has been the president in Venezuela. Also since then, there have been significant irregularities in various elections, multiple protests, and the consolidation of authoritarianism or dictatorial rule in Venezuela, which already started with Hugo Chavez. Venezuela, which already has faced repression and irregularities in various elections. On top of that, security forces and allied armed groups have suppressed protests and restricted freedom of speech and assembly within the country. The years between 2014 and 2018, right after the death of Hugo Chavez, are going to be very important in what will come next in Venezuela. One, it was a period in which the United States and other countries like Canada, Switzerland, Mexico, Panama, and members of the European Union imposed sanctions towards Venezuela. These sanctions started to be imposed after security forces violently repressed student protests in 2014 against the regime. It is estimated that in 2014, for example, 43 people died and 800 were injured in clashes between pro-Maduro forces and student-led protesters. Maduro imprisoned opposition figures and individuals that were loyal to Chavez, but not necessarily were loyal to him. Second, this was a period in which the Venezuelan opposition managed to win the legislative elections of December 2015 and control Venezuelan parliament. The National Assembly, for the first time after 16 years, were able to be controlled by opposition political parties. However, in 2017, the regime controls Venezuela Supreme Court announced that the court was taking over the functions of the National Assembly. And in that same year, there was a referendum to approve the creation of a constitute assembly, which in a sense, the objective of that new assembly was to rewrite the constitution. That constitute assembly did not create a new constitution, but it weakened the real power of the National Assembly, which again was controlled by opposition political parties. Third, also in 2017, there were other protests that lasted 4 months. It is estimated that in those protests in 2017, around 160 people were killed during these protests. Members of the security forces and government armed gangs called colectivos in Venezuela attacked protesters in the streets using extreme and sometimes deadly force, killing dozens and injuring hundreds of people. Authorities detained thousands of protesters and bystanders, many of whom were later prosecuted by military courts. All these events led the United States, Canada, Switzerland, the European Union, and some countries in Latin America to sanction the government of Venezuela, Just to give you some perspective about these sanctions, by January 2021, the Treasury Department had imposed sanctions on roughly 166 Venezuelans or Venezuelan connected individuals, including Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and his family, and sanctioned more than 47 entities or companies, including the state oil company in Venezuela called PDVSA. Also, the State Department had revoked the visas of more than 1,000 individuals and their families. As you can see in this graph that I'm showing you here, that I made for a publication, most sanctions between 2006 and 2019 have been imposed by the United States, followed by Canada, Panama, Colombia, the European Union, Switzerland, and Mexico. Since 2019, there hasn't been a diplomatic relationship between the United States and Venezuela, which means that there is not a diplomatic representation or an embassy between these two countries, which make things very difficult for Venezuelans living in the United States to have access to consular services, as well as for those Americans that live in Venezuela. However, there is a Venezuelan Affairs unit in the US Embassy in Bogota for Venezuelans that need to, for example, renew their visas, or they need to request other paperwork to enter the United States. While all these protests were taking place and the regime of Nicolas Maduro was consolidating his power and autocratic rule in Venezuela, there were other issues that were affecting the population in Venezuela, and in fact have been the notorious issues in many international headlines, including high inflation, high levels of oppression, lack of food and medicine, and shortage of basic services such as water, gas, and electricity. The humanitarian situation in Venezuela has been unique, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but the rest of the world, given that today Venezuelans are escaping for a country that it's not in a war, for example, like Ukraine or Syria. Just to give you some examples of how problematic has been the situation in Venezuela, only in March 2019, the country faced a national electric shutdown. Many states spent weeks, not days, but weeks without electric power. This, of course, affected access to fresh water and other services as well. Many people have died of malnutrition given the lack of food in certain areas of the country, particularly in rural areas. A growing number of children suffering from malnutrition, which has affected their performance at school. And recently it was published a case in which not only kids are dying because of malnutrition, but also college professors, since they are not able to survive with a salary which is approximately $25 a month if you are a full professor. Aside from this socioeconomic reality, there is a repression from security state forces and pro-government armed groups that attack opposition leaders and protesters. All these have led many Venezuelans to leave the country due to the economic and political turmoil. Today, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is seen as one of the biggest ones, along with the Syrian, Afghan, and Ukrainian refugees crisis. Now, what has been the political crisis in Venezuela, and why has been Venezuela mentioned on many international headlines? In May 2018, there was a presidential election that was viewed by many opposition Venezuelan groups and members of the international community as illegitimate. That election was not fair nor free. Additionally, they were not considered competitive, which means that not many political parties and candidates were allowed or had the opportunity to run for the presidency. The Electoral National Council was in the hands of the government or was controlled by the regime of Nicolas Maduro, as well as courts and the Supreme Court. The presidential election was won by, of course, Nicolas Maduro for another 6 years presidential term. At that moment, the United States, the European Union, Canada, and other countries didn't recognize the result. In January 2019, there was a crisis that is known as the presidential crisis of 2019 in Venezuela, in which, according to the Venezuelan constitution, Maduro has not been the legitimate president of the country since January 10, 2019. According to the constitution, when a president or a presidential candidate wins an election, the candidate must be proclaimed proclaimed as president by the National Assembly, which at that moment was controlled by the opposition, and the president of the National Assembly was Juan Guaido. Since Maduro didn't do that and decided to be proclaimed by the loyal Supreme Court, Juan Guaido, a pretty much unknown politician, which was already set to be the new president of the National Assembly, was proclaimed the interim president of Venezuela. According to the Constitution, if the president is unable to take office or is not proclaimed by the National Assembly, the second in line is the president of the National Assembly. Over 50 countries denounced Maduro's regime, his consolidation of autocratic rule, and recognized Juan Guaido as interim president until free and fair elections can be held. Among the countries that recognize Guaido are the United States. I don't know if you remember this, but in 2020, Guaido was actually present at the State of the Union after being invited by then President Donald Trump. Also Canada, Colombia, and members of the European Union decided to recognize Juan Guaido, among, of course, other countries in Latin America. Those that remain loyal to Nicolas Maduro were regimes in Russia, China, Syria, Iran, and Turkey. So you can see how democratic regimes versus non-democratic regimes were supporting each candidate or each individual in Venezuela and in this crisis. Given the presidential crisis and to cut Maduro's access to oil revenues, the United States implemented more sanctions preventing state oil company PDVSA from collecting proceeds on crude exports to US refineries. However, over time, Maduro has been able to sell oils to other markets like the Russian one and use Russian companies to sell Venezuelan oil to India and China. So Maduro has had some strategies to divert the consequence of those economic sanctions. These presidential crises and sanctions imposed on Venezuela have brought challenges to Venezuelans. Today, Venezuelans are still one of the major refugees groups in Latin America. Most of these refugees have gone to Colombia, and some of them have gone as far as Argentina by foot, spending weeks carrying bags and facing many challenges. The Venezuelan refugees crisis has brought the good and the bad in many countries. Some countries have been welcoming these refugees, like the case of Colombia, while others have protested them and in some cases impose rules and laws that violate respect for the human rights and the lives of these refugees. In 2021, the Homeland Security Department extended Venezuelans living in the United States the temporary protected status for the first time, as it has been extended to other refugees and immigrants coming from El Salvador, Haiti, Syria, and most likely Ukraine. It is already 2022, and there are still problems in Venezuela. Many have no access to the internet, gasoline, electricity, and other basic services. Those that have access to American dollars can buy goods at a high inflated price, while there is a big socioeconomic sector that cannot afford to buy in dollars. Most Venezuelans do not receive salaries in dollars, but in the national currency, which is El Bolivar. The gap between the poor and the wealthy is bigger than ever. Inflation is 3 digits now, according to governmental sources, and it is not expected to diminish anytime soon. On top of that, many communities are living under attacks perpetrated by security forces or armed groups like Colombia guerrillas that have bases or have taken territories in Venezuela, particularly in the borderline with Colombian states like Táchira, like Zulia, like Apure. And these presidential crises, along with the humanitarian crisis and recent talks between the US envoys to Caracas and members of the Maduro regime, have been all issues that have made Venezuela appear in the news since 2019, and why today we're talking about Venezuela and many people around the world have seen an interest in knowing more about Venezuela. The situation is still precarious, although, you know, even when people are spending dollars or buying certain expensive cars, particularly in Caracas, the capital city, or you have started to see international events happening in Venezuela, the situation in Venezuela is still not better. Depending on what you read, you're going to have a different perspective of the country and what's happening in Venezuela. In some cases, you will think that the situation in Venezuela is better, and the reality is far more complex than that. The economy, as I mentioned before, is not stable. Sanctions are still in force, and there is a high level of corruption as well as over control of public branches and elections of the regime party. So how do we make sense of this reality? How exactly do we know what to read and whether the sources that you are exploring are actually valid? I want to finish this presentation by recommending some news or analysis sources to stay current on the situation in Venezuela. As it happens on a global scale, polarization is something that permeates the way how we consume news and how a piece of news is presented to the public. So keeping that in mind, I'm listing here some sources that I personally follow in English, beyond the ones that, of course, I find and I follow in Spanish, that I consider good sources to stay up to date about the situation in Venezuela. Some of these sources are based in Venezuela, others are outside of Venezuela. For example, Caracas Chronicle is a source that is based in Venezuela and makes the effort of providing information and analysis in English for those that cannot follow news in Spanish. There are think tanks and centers like the Woodrow Wilson Center that have Latin American programs with excellent analysis regarding Latin America and Venezuela. Each of these sources addresses, for the most part, different aspects of Venezuela. If you are only interested in the refugee situation, the United Nations migration website is good to follow. If you are looking for analysis related to the humanitarian crisis, political violence, and protests, the Crisis Group website is good for that. If you're interested in Twitter accounts, I suggest at least these 6 in English. They are good to stay current, having access to some events pertaining to Venezuela, like the Inter-American Dialogue, and to know more about specific issues such as political violence in Venezuela or the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. I hope this presentation has sparked your interest in Venezuela, and I'm happy to answer any questions now and continue the discussion with Matthew about what's happening in Venezuela right now. Thank you very much for having me tonight.
Adriana, that was fabulous, and I'm so grateful for the context you offered, the current events that you offered, and the way that you stitched it all together. There are so many places that we could dive in. I wonder if we could start with just sort of South America as a whole, because it's a really interesting continent that is not very familiar to many folks in the US. As you noted in your presentation, a large number of dictatorships over time in South America in particular, but throughout Latin America. How would you contrast what's happening right now in Venezuela with some of those other historical situations in Chile or Argentina or Brazil? What are the major differences that you would point to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And well, the first difference is that, first is that Venezuela went from a country that was transitioning to democracy to suddenly go back and become more authoritarian, while those dictatorships of the 60s, 70s, 80s, for the most part, never saw democracy before. And that's a major and huge difference between authoritarianism today in Venezuela versus authoritarianism in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that is a very important distinction, because, you know, I grew up in Venezuela, my parents grew up in Venezuela, so they lived under democratic rule. While those parents, grandparents that were living in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s never saw democracy until the 90s and the 2000s, in many cases, such as Chile, such as, you know, Argentina and other countries that I already mentioned. So that's a first distinction. The second distinction is that today, the type of authoritarian rule that we see in Venezuela is what we call personalist authoritarianism, which is a leader that is concentrated the power in his hands, creates institutions that fits his own view of the regime, and of course is surrounded by loyalists. The type of dictatorships that we saw back in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s were mostly military dictatorships, in which you have a junta, in which you have military officers taking control of the regime, right? But they needed to somehow distribute spoils, distribute somehow resources to all officers, so the main leader, the central leader, will not be deposed or overthrown from power. The other thing, of course, the difference is that Venezuela, when we compare, for example, the economies of Venezuela versus Chile, for example, we'll see that Venezuela is very rich in oil, which is, you know, something that right now, because of the war, is going to benefit the regime of Nicolas Maduro. When we see the economies in Chile, Chile right now is considered one of the most developed economies in Latin America, while Venezuela is not. But for a very long time, Venezuela was because of oil. What's the difference here? That the regime has been able to not only support the regime based on oil production, but also illegal activities, while back in the 60s, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, the type of economy that was sustaining these regimes were pretty much from the agriculture area. And they needed to manage ways to support themselves because they were not rich in something like oil. I mean, you don't need to make the effort to produce oil. Oil is just there. And so for that reason, the regime has been able to keep producing, right, selling that oil and sustain the regime. But that was not the case for many of the dictatorships back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I really appreciate your drawing out those differences. You know, the refugee and migrant flows that we've seen coming out of Venezuela have been staggering. And I think that because of the situation in Ukraine, that's really fallen off the radar for many people. Colombia, as you mentioned, has been particularly welcoming to the neighbors in Venezuela. And there's as you know very well, and for the benefit of our audience, there's a very important historical relationship between Colombia and Venezuela. Where they were actually part of the same country for a number of years until the separation happened. There is an election coming up shortly in Colombia. Do you have a sense of how that could impact one way or another Colombia's approach? I mean, is there a united approach in Colombia about Venezuelan refugees, or is there some dissension?
Yeah, well, I mean, like every single country in the world, including the United States, everything is complex when it comes to elections, right? And at this point, I believe that the main two candidates are the one from the left, which is Gustavo Petro, and the other one, which is Hernandez, right? And part of the problem with that is that when you live in a very polarized situation, context, economy, the problem is that voters like us need to make the decision of either go with the left or either go to the right. But sometimes, you know, that idea of abstaining is no longer helping the changes, the political changes in our countries. So the polarization in Colombia is the same that we see elsewhere, like it happened in Chile some months ago or some weeks ago, the one that we see in Venezuela, again in the United States. I believe that in the case of the refugees, the Venezuelan refugees in Colombia, there have been some narrative particularly in the left, that tend to deny the level of crisis that we see in Venezuela, which is problematic because we don't know that if, for example, the leftist candidate wins the election, if he's going to change things regarding, you know, the welcoming and all the changes that Ivan Duque has done in terms of how they can incorporate Venezuelans into the Colombian economy and the country. I think, though, that overall, Colombians are very sympathetic of Venezuelan refugees, and that's because Colombians have been also refugees in the past. If you go to Costa Rica, if you go to the United States, when I lived in Missouri for 6 years, the amount of Mexicans and Colombians were the most populous Latin American groups in Missouri. You go to Florida and it's the same. So Colombians know what is to live in a crisis, in a situation that probably is not the same like Venezuela is facing right now, but they know that when you are facing a situation like this one, your only option, if you have the means, is to pretty much escape, right? And so for that reason, overall, many have been sympathetic. Still, there are some narrative that come from the left, and we have seen also that from the right, that say, well, I mean, Venezuela's changed the landscape in Colombia, and we need to stop this if we don't want to lose our country and have Venezuelans, you know, penetrating every single aspect of our country. We have seen, for example, you know, what the mayor in Bogota, Claudia Lopez, has said about Venezuelans, which has not been, you know, very welcoming. People like her and leaders in Colombia, some of them have, you know, treat Venezuelans as, you know, as very badly, saying that they are the reason why we see more violence and insecurity in Colombia, when it has been shown that that's not the case. So going back to your question about election, I think that, and I don't want to say much about what I think who is going to win the election. I think that the polarization is not helping. This election is not going to help Colombia. If the right wins the election, most likely, at least for a short period of time, we are going to see that candidate, it's going to continue the policies of that Ivan Duque put in place about Venezuela and other issues. Coming from the left, I think that in the short run, I think that we are going to see a change because of the reasons that I already mentioned. The narrative has been to deny that there is a crisis in Venezuela.
Well, and it's a layered crisis, right? That's been going on for many years in different ways: an economic crisis, a political crisis, gosh, in COVID, a health crisis, right? And when you think about the flow of people out of Venezuela, and we're seeing it in Ukraine today as well, where some people are actually choosing to come back, right? Because they're not finding a place to land. They're not finding a sustainable situation outside of the country, so they're actually coming back. Do you have a sense, Adriana, about whether any of these crises are abating at all? You know, as I have followed Latin America during, especially during the last couple of years, looking at, the layered crises going on in Venezuela, something's got to give at some point, right?
Right. But I think that crisis is not going to end until we actually see a change in politics, the economy, and the regime. And by change, I don't mean that if Nicolas Maduro is overthrown tomorrow, things are going to change rapidly in Venezuela, because the crisis has been, as you mentioned before, has been for a very long time. We have been at least for 8 years, you know, trying to, you know, solve problems, political problems, social problems, economic problems. And the issue is that you cannot change that from one day to the other. You need a lot of investments. You need to call for investors to come to Venezuela, and that takes time, because no one is going to Venezuela if they don't have security, if they are not going to be able to be free to do the businesses that they want to do in Venezuela. And so that requires a lot of investment, but also it requires political changes. And I think that part of the political change that can lead to changes in Venezuela is that if we can see, you know, that there are elections that can be partially be, you know, transparent, free, and fair, where you have competition, in a regime that definitely will need to account for both opposition leaders, opposition groups, but also individuals that today are part of the regime. We cannot erase history. We cannot erase the fact that Chavez was there, Nicolas Maduro was there, the current political elite has been there for 20 years. And so in a potential transition to democracy, we definitely need to account for people that still believe that the way to survive and to have, you know, a good life in Venezuela is to follow the ideals of Hugo Chavez. Because one thing that, for example, I didn't mention in my presentation is that when Chavez died, many people decided to vote for Maduro, thinking that Maduro was going to be exactly like Hugo Chavez. And Maduro has been very different from Hugo Chavez. He still uses the image of Chavez. He still says that he's the son of Hugo Chavez. but it is pretty clear that there are differences as to not only in charisma, but the ways how Maduro has been controlling not only institutions, but the entire country. So I think that the possibility of change in Venezuela requires not only investments, not only the idea that we need to somehow diversify the economy, because 98% of the revenues are because of oil. And we have so much more than that. And so diversifying the economy, not making the oil the priority, but also a political change that will account for the current elite and opposition elite, I think that will make a potential change, political change, and a transition toward democracy in Venezuela.
Last year, we had Professor George Lopez from the University of Notre Dame with us talking about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. And I think there were major questions when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, and the major response seemed to be around sanctions about individuals and organizations and companies and so on. And a lot of that was memory about what happened in Venezuela. To what extent would you say US sanctions on Venezuela or other countries' response to Venezuela have had an effect? Because based on our conversation today, it seems like the situation remains pretty dire.
Yeah, and you know, you're going to find experts saying that, because I have read a lot about whether sanctions have pushed somehow Venezuela to go through this crisis, while others are saying, I mean, this crisis already started before those economic sanctions were imposed by the United States, Canada, and other countries. And my take on this is that economic sanctions have hurt the economy in Venezuela in a direct or indirect way. And the way how I see is that, and there is a lot of academic work that explain this. When a regime or a leader is sanctioned directly, where that leader cannot travel abroad, bank accounts are sanctioned, are freeze. It's not able to have visas. In other words, is constrained by those sanctions. Most likely that leader is going to take on the population. So you're going to see more repression. You are going to see that the redistribution of resources are going to be less for the population and more for those that the leader wants those to be loyal to him. And that's something that we have seen over time in Venezuela. So these sanctions, of course, have been paid by the population because we have seen more repression. We have seen more people dying because of protest, because we have seen the lack of food, the lack of medicine, and that's a way of social control by the leader, because he's pretty much saying, well, if I'm sanctioned because you asked for that, you are going to pay for those sanctions. While on the other side, the leader is also diverting the effects of those sanctions by, for example, selling the oil that the United States is not buying from Venezuela to Russia or to India or to China. And so in some ways, of course, economic sanctions have hurt the economy of Venezuela, and the crisis could be ameliorated if those sanctions are released. In fact, this week, some individuals, I believe like 25 individuals, signed a letter to Joe Biden asking Joe Biden to release those sanctions. The problem with that is that sanctions were imposed because the United States wanted the regime of Venezuela to respect human rights and to respect democracy. If you don't have those sanctions in place, what's the alternative, right? And so it is a very complicated issue, the economic sanctions, because on the one hand, I don't think that economic sanctions by themselves work to change regimes, work for democracy, work for human rights, because we have seen that in other countries have not worked. Let me talk about Russia. Russia has been sanctioned since 2014 because of the invasion in Crimea in 2014. Gazprom, the Russian state company, was sanctioned at that time. And even with those sanctions, Gazprom was able to build the pipeline between Russia and Germany. So those sanctions were not in reality hurting the company. Those sanctions were not hurting elites, oligarchs in Russia, because they were able to put, open bank accounts in Switzerland with, other names, have more yachts, Also, there is a report by the US Congress that mentioned how oligarchs in Russia have been able to divert sanctions through black markets such as art. And so those are the things that make economic sanctions difficult, not only for the leader, but also for the population, because in the end, they are the ones that are going to pay for those sanctions.
You know, I think a lot of us were surprised a few weeks ago when US policy, de facto policy at least, seemed to change through direct interaction with the Maduro regime. You know, you mentioned in 2019, and US and a number of other countries are sticking up for Guaido, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But in the situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and especially the energy implications of that, we've got a couple questions coming in from the audience. Can you talk about the symbolic value of US direct engagement with the Maduro regime and what the US might be thinking about in terms of energy opportunities?
Right. So in 2019, the US decided to impose sanctions on the oil company, the Venezuelan oil company, PDVSA. And right now, just to give a context, right now, Venezuela is producing 700,000 barrels per day. 20 years ago, Venezuela used to produce more than 3 million barrels per day. So you can see how that production has decreased and how those revenues have decreased for Nicolas Maduro in this case, right? What happened after the United States imposed those sanctions? That technically no company in the United States is able right now to trade with that company in Venezuela, and it's not able to somehow receive oil from Venezuela. Of course, that's problematic because Venezuela, as I mentioned in my presentation, was in the 20th century a very loyal supplier of oil to the United States. And now, since we don't have that market anymore, for Nicolas Maduro, the question was, well, how exactly am I going to sell the small production that I still have here? And so what Nicolas Maduro did was that part of those barrels are sold to Gazprom and Rosneft, and they are selling that oil, or were selling that oil before the invasion of February 2022 to India and China. And that was the way how China was receiving that oil. Why was not China receiving oil directly from Venezuela? Because of the economic sanctions. And China has been strategic about how China relates to Russia right now and also Venezuela, because in the end, China doesn't want to receive economic sanctions from the United States and the European Union. So since 2019, oil still is important for Venezuela, but Venezuela needs right now to sell that oil through other markets, sometimes in the black market, sometimes in a very, in a different price than the international one, at discounted prices, because again, no one wants to buy that oil that is sanctioned by the United States. And the other thing is that the regime, knowing that that production has not been increasing or good, right? Now, then the regime in Venezuela has been able to also trade in the black market, illegal mining and selling gold, for example, to Turkey and Russia. And that has been, another way how the regime has been able to sustain itself over the years. Now, your question was, well, what happens now that the United States and some envoys went to Caracas in March? Well, I mean, are things going to change with Venezuela? In perspective, these kind of communications and dialogues between governments take a lot of preparation. It's something that doesn't happen from one day to the other. And so it seems that those negotiations were going to take place either way, with the war in Ukraine or not, between the United States and Venezuela. It happened to be that was in the middle or the start of the war in Ukraine. That conversation was mostly about, from the regime side, how the United States was going to lift those sanctions, while for the United States was more about, there are some Americans that are in jail in Venezuela, and we want them released. We want them with us. And so I believe that they released 4 American citizens at that time, at the beginning of March this year. but no sanctions have been lifted in the case of Venezuela. There is a company which is big, which is Chevron, that has been for many, many years trying to lobby here in the United States for the government in the United States to lift those sanctions, because Chevron knows that as soon as Venezuela is, open to investments and it's no longer sanctioned by the United States and other members of the international community, they are the ones that want to be first extracting oil in Venezuela. Because again, Venezuela is very rich in oil, and still we have the most important reserve in the world. So that's pretty much what the conversation was about this year. That doesn't mean that things are going to change anytime soon. Just because also, not only that conversation took time in preparation, but also we need to know how the war in Ukraine is going to develop and how Russia is going to stand in that war.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We do also have a question coming in about Juan Guaido. It's been really fascinating to watch, and I think so many countries around the world and so many sort of everyday people who don't maybe follow Venezuela closely saw this happening and said, oh, okay, this is the person who's going to take Venezuela out of this. He is the rightful president according to the Constitution, or according to an interpretation of the Constitution. And then he sort of went away. He's still there, right? But the sort of momentum that he was building seemed to dissipate some. Can you give us a sense of where that is today? Are things just terribly stymied? Has anything moved forward in the legislature there?
Right. So when Juan Guaido was proclaimed by the National Assembly as the interim president in January 2019, quite honestly, not many people knew about Juan Guaido. And why is that? Because according to the elections of 2015, in which the National Assembly was now under the power of opposition political parties, part of the rule that they settled back then was that every year they are going to rotate the presidency of the National Assembly among the political parties that had most votes, right? And so it turns out that casually, January 2019, it was the political party of Juan Guaido, which is Voluntad Popular. And back then, no one knew exactly if it was going to be him or another member of the political party. And again, it was just casual that he was proclaimed president of the National Assembly, and some days later, he was like, no, I'm going to be proclaimed the interim president because this is a situation based on the Constitution. Now, he had a lot of momentum in the first half of 2019. And I don't know if those that are attending this event read the headlines about the humanitarian crisis and how people were going from Venezuela to Colombia, and people were trying to get food and medicines into Venezuela. It was, a complete crisis back then. But the problem is that over time, and due to the pandemic, of course, that momentum has been lost. Juan Guaido already lost that momentum at the end of 2019. Why? Because when he was proclaimed interim president of Venezuela, he mentioned that one of the things that he was going to do was to get rid of Nicolas Maduro through elections. And that has not happened yet. And so people over time are asking, well, what's going on? Why we're not getting elections? Why aren't you getting rid of Nicolas Maduro? Nicolas Maduro is still there and you're losing power. And on top of that, last year, there were other parliamentary elections. Opposition leaders and opposition political parties didn't get enough vote because many of them decided to abstain from the election. And so right now, the National Assembly is in the hands of the regime. And due to that, now the international community at the beginning of this year were wondering, well, if he's no longer the president of the National Assembly, should we support Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela or not? Some, like the European Union, have said that they don't recognize the election of December last year. And for that reason, they believe that still Juan Guaido is the president of the National Assembly and the interim president of Venezuela. So it's a little bit complex.
much of an issue do you expect this to be in the US presidential election in 2024? Because in theory, that's when the next presidential elections are also supposed to be happening.
Right.
In Venezuela. I mean, do you think that that coincidence of timing will make it more of an issue that's talked about in the US?
Absolutely. I think that there's going to be some narrative about Venezuela. It was a narrative last time. Let's just remember that at some point, I believe someone in the Republican Party or those that were supporting Donald Trump started to spread this misinformation about that Hugo Chavez was, behind the election. And I was like, but Hugo Chavez has been dead since March 2013. And so, but they use that as an image of the bad socialists, right? And that's something that is going to come up again in 2024, as well as we're going to see some narrative in Venezuela about the United States for the presidential election. I mean, it has been always like that. The United States has been always present in the narrative in elections in Venezuela. Now Venezuela is part of the narrative because of the last 24 years of crisis and mismanagement and politics in Venezuela.
And another country in the region that has parallels with Venezuela is Cuba, which has an historical relationship with Venezuela. Can you talk a little bit about Cuba's relationship with Venezuela? We have a question in particular about the presence of Cuban military in Venezuela.
So Cuba and Venezuela, that relationship was strengthened since the beginning of the 2000s. And it was because Hugo Chavez saw Fidel Castro as his father. And he took from Fidel Castro every single possible, ideals. And he saw again Fidel Castro as the great father of not only Cuba, but Venezuela and Latin America in general. And since the 2000s, Venezuela started to sign agreements with Cuba in which Cuba will send doctors to Venezuela. And that's something that it's not only in Venezuela, but in other countries as well, like Mexico, Bolivia, Brazil. But on top of that, Cuba will receive preferential, prices for oil. And in some cases, Venezuela simply just gave oil to Cuba just for free. And so Cuba, for many years, particularly with Hugo Chavez when he was in power, Cuba saw a really good time because it was getting oil. Cuba knew that could control Hugo Chavez and institutions in Venezuela. There are some reports from organizations in Venezuela that show, for example, that some Cubans are in control of the identity of Venezuelans. Like, for example, if you go and you try to get your ID or your passport, those are behind that are from Cuba. Those that have trained political policy forces or security forces in Venezuela are Cubans. Those that decided to protect Hugo Chavez after a coup attempt in 2002 after Hugo Chavez were Cubans. And so Cubans have been in Venezuela for a very, very long time. And that relationship has been mostly political and geostrategic for the regime because they know that they can count on Cuba and Cuba can count on Venezuela. The only problem is that since Maduro took power in 2013, of course, the economy in Venezuela has decreased, a lot of inflation. And that's also have been difficult for Cuba because Cuba now it's not receiving exactly the same things that used to receive before Maduro. And so the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela is still there, specifically in terms of politics and geostrategic, relations between both governments. But over time have changed, especially because of the economy of Venezuela and because Venezuela is no longer supporting pretty much the economy in Cuba.
We have one final question that's come in, and we're very short on time, and I'm trying to figure out how we turn this into a question that could be answered simply. The great power competition, US, Russia, and China, which has been gone in a whole other direction now with what's going on in Eastern Europe. If economic sanctions are lifted because of the US demand for energy, does Venezuela become sort of the center of some sort of proxy competition among these powers all in the same place? because it seems like there's this historic interest, obviously because of oil. Do you expect that we could see Russia, more Russian and Chinese involvement in the Western Hemisphere as a result of that?
Well, it depends on different things. One is the war in Ukraine. I think that if Russia is still involved in Ukraine, it's going to be very difficult to Russia to care about countries so far from Eastern Europe and his own neighborhood. The second thing is that even when Venezuela has been sanctioned by the United States and the European Union and other countries, China still has a lot of investments in Venezuela. Hasn't been able to provide more investments in the past 2 years because the regime hasn't been able to repay some of the loans, for example, but China still has a presence in Venezuela. So there are certain sectors that China doesn't want to meddle with because those are areas that are sanctioned by the United States. That doesn't mean that China is not relating to Venezuela at all. And so, and the third thing is that even if economic sanctions are lifted tomorrow, again, I mean, the transition is going to be hard in Venezuela. It's going to take a lot of time. And so it's going to be interesting to see how political change comes about in Venezuela, because if Venezuela finally is able to transit towards democracy, less likely Russia is going to be able to have a partnership with a Venezuelan regime, while the United States and China are going to be able to fight for that, you know, that area. So in a future scenario, we'll see that if those sanctions are lifted, definitely the fight somehow is going to be between the United States and China, because China is already a super economic power that has even more presence in Latin America than Russia. And so that fight definitely is going to be between the United States and China, but not so much Russia.
And China certainly needs the resources for so many reasons. Right. Gosh, Adriana, I can't thank you enough for your insightful presentation, for this conversation today. It's been a real delight, and we will continue to watch what's happening in Venezuela with great interest, because you know it's not just about what's in Venezuela, as you mentioned very well. There's a whole region at stake with